The cottage had been abandoned for years. Ivy curled through shattered windows, and the roof sagged like it had grown weary of holding up the sky. On a rainy afternoon in County Clare, 1953, a team of men came to assess the property. The plan was simple: tear it down and make way for a new road. But nothing about that day would be simple. As they pulled up rotted floorboards in the back room, the hammer of one labourer struck something unexpected. Not wood, not stone. A hollow thud, muffled. Curious, he pried deeper. Beneath layers of dirt and broken boards, a small cavity appeared. What they found inside stopped them cold. Two skeletons, side by side, curled against each other. Their arms intertwined, hands laced together as if caught mid-embrace. Time had stripped them of flesh, but not of the intimacy they shared. The room fell silent, rain tapping against broken glass. The foreman muttered something about the police, but even his voice was hushed, as if speaking louder might wake the dead. Who were they? News spread quickly. Locals gathered by the gate, whispering legends and suspicions. Some said it was a murder-suicide. Others swore it had to be a lover's pact. An old man claimed he'd seen a woman in that house decades ago, always alone, always staring out the window. No one could remember her name. The investigators found something else, a rusted tin box behind a panel in the wall. Inside were dozens of fragile letters, browned with age but preserved well enough to read. The writing was beautiful, delicate cursive on yellowed paper. Each letter signed the same: "Forever yours, Moira." It was the beginning of a story no one expected, but before we unfold this tragic and beautiful tale of devotion that defied time, borders, and even death itself, take a moment to subscribe. These forgotten histories deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring more of them to light. Back in the small room, one officer carefully opened the first letter. It was dated March 17th, 1882. "My dearest Eamon," it began, "I found you once, and I will not lose you again, even if the world tears itself apart." As they continued reading, a pattern emerged. The letters told of a love torn by distance, class, silence. They hinted at long travels, secret meetings, unbearable longing. And slowly, they stitched together a tapestry of two lives so deeply woven into each other that they seemed to pulse with breath, even now. The coroner determined the bodies had been buried together for over half a century. No signs of trauma, no struggle, no violence. Just stillness, peace, a chosen sleep. One question echoed through every newspaper headline: why did no one look for them? But perhaps the more piercing question was, did they want to be found at all? As dawn broke over the Irish hills the next day, the house stood like a monument, not to tragedy but to memory. The letters were taken into evidence, but the words had already begun to escape. A schoolteacher transcribed them by hand. A journalist began writing a feature. A young poet called it The Grave of the Lovers, and from there their story began its slow rebirth. But before we can understand the end, we must begin at the beginning. Not in 1953, but nearly a century before, when Ireland groaned under the weight of famine and empires, and two young souls found each other in defiance of everything around them. This is the story of Eamon and Moira Delaney, the boy from the fields, the girl behind the stone walls. They swore never to part, and they meant it. Eamon Delaney was born in the shadow of hunger. County Clare in the 1850s was a place of silent fields and louder griefs, where the wind carried the memory of a famine that had not yet loosened its grip. His family, like many, survived by stubbornness more than luck. They lived in a stone cottage with a thatched roof that leaked in winter and baked in summer. Eamon's father was a tenant farmer, his back bent by years of toil for someone else's profit. But Eamon had something many others lacked: fire. Even as a boy, his eyes burned with questions, his laughter pierced silence like a slingshot cracking glass. He learned to read from a traveling priest who passed through once a month. He read everything he could find: newspapers lining crates, pamphlets in pubs, the Book of Psalms whispered over sleeping siblings. And then there was Moira. Moira Kavanagh was born just 3 miles away, but her world could not have been more different. The Kavanagh estate sat high on a hill, its windows tall and clean, its servants quiet and trained. Moira was the daughter of Seamus Kavanagh, landowner and magistrate. Her mother had died young, leaving the girl with a strict governess and a father who considered affection a distraction from duty. She grew up surrounded by porcelain and expectations, but beneath the lace gloves and rehearsed curtsies, Moira kept her own fire. She read poetry by candlelight, recited Byron under her breath, and once snuck out just to see the sea at midnight. Her heart longed for something not found in corridors or carriages, something unscripted. They met by accident, or perhaps by fate. One spring morning, Eamon had been helping his uncle clear a broken fence near the border of the Kavanagh land. Moira was on horseback returning from a visit to her aunt's home. Her horse, startled at a hare, reared and nearly threw her. Eamon was the only one near. He steadied the reins, his hands rough and steady. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She blinked, startled, not just by the fall but by the question. No servant had ever spoken to her so directly. She shook her head, muttered a thank you, and rode off. But she didn't forget. A week later she returned, walking this time. She claimed she liked the wildflowers that bloomed near the broken fence. Eamon was there again. This time they spoke longer. They began meeting in secret, under trees, beside streams, in the ruined chapel near the woods. They talked about books, the world beyond Ireland, what freedom meant. Moira brought him poetry. Eamon brought her stories of survival, jokes from the pub, verses he'd memorized from the Psalms. It wasn't long before love found them, not the loud, reckless kind, but something deep, wordless, sacred. It lived in glances held too long, hands brushed as they passed a book, the silence between breaths that somehow felt full. But they knew the danger. Moira's father would never approve. A Kavanagh daughter marrying a Delaney farm boy? It would be scandal. Worse, it could be ruin for Eamon, for his family. Yet they kept meeting, unable to stop what had already taken root. One night, beneath a sky blanketed with stars, Eamon looked at her and said, "If there's a way to be with you, I'll find it, even if it means crossing oceans." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "Then I'll wait. No matter how long, I'll wait." The vow was simple, quiet, but it carried the weight of a promise neither understood fully yet. Their world was not kind to love like theirs, and time, like landowners and laws, was already working against them. Their meetings grew bolder, though never careless. Moira began slipping away at dusk, cloaked not just in shawls but in the thrill of being seen by someone who truly knew her. Eamon waited in the ruins of the old chapel, their private world of stone and shadow, poetry and whispers. Each time they parted, it felt harder to let go, but secrets in small towns are rarely kept. One evening, just after the harvest, Seamus Kavanagh returned home earlier than expected. A stable boy mentioned seeing Miss Moira near the chapel again. Suspicion bloomed into fury. That night, Moira was summoned to her father's study. His voice was cold, sharp as shattered glass. "You will never see that boy again." She tried to speak, to explain, but he raised his hand, not to strike, but to silence. "You are a Kavanagh. Do not disgrace your mother's name." She was locked in her room. Her governess removed ink and paper, bolted the shutters, and posted a servant at the door. Moira wept until dawn, heart pounding with more fear than sorrow. She didn't know if Eamon would come, didn't know if he'd understand. But Eamon waited at the chapel. Hours passed, the sky grew thick with clouds, and still he waited. When she didn't appear, he knew something was wrong. 2 nights later, he snuck onto the estate. The fields were empty, the wind loud. He crept to her window and whispered her name. A flicker of movement, a face behind the curtain. Then a candle, then a note dropped from the window, tied to a ribbon. "They've taken everything. I don't know how long I'll be kept. Don't stop believing, I won't." It was enough. Eamon knew he had no future in Clare. Word was already spreading. The Kavanaghs had power. A single accusation could mean prison or worse. He didn't fear for himself, but for his brothers, his parents, his name. If he stayed, he would endanger them all. But if he left, he could build something worth bringing her into. He told no one. The night before his departure, he returned to the chapel, left a note in the stone niche they often used for hiding books. "I go to make our way. I will write. I will come back. I swear it on everything I am." Moira found the letter days later, after bribing the cook for a walk. She read it under the same yew tree where they'd first kissed, and held it to her chest like a prayer. She began to write letters, dozens. Some she smuggled out through servants. Others she gave to the gardener's son, who promised to send them from town. Weeks passed, then months, then a year. No reply. Eamon had crossed the Atlantic and landed in Boston. He wrote too, long, breathless pages telling of ships and soot, of dreams stitched between shipyard shifts. He sent them to her father's estate, to her aunt in Dublin, to any address she'd once mentioned. But silence was all that returned. Each believed the other had forgotten. But the truth was more cruel. Moira's father had intercepted the letters, burned them, every word, every vow. He hired men to watch her, forbade her from setting foot beyond the gates unaccompanied. She was moved to a cousin's estate in the north. There, she walked the gardens like a ghost. She didn't cry anymore. Eamon, meanwhile, tried to bury himself in work, but his hands, though calloused, still remembered her skin. His ears, though full of hammer strikes, still sought her voice in crowds, and his heart, his stubborn Irish heart, never stopped asking what had gone wrong. And so, across an ocean, two souls waited, apart, unknowing, unyielding. Boston in the 1860s was a city of fire and ice, ambition flaring in the factories, cold eyes in alleyways. Immigrants crowded its streets, most with little more than hope in their pockets. Eamon Delaney arrived with even less, stepping onto American soil, carrying only a suitcase, a cross, and Moira's name etched in memory. He found work in the shipyards. Long hours, dangerous conditions, meager pay. But Eamon welcomed the pain. It dulled the ache in his chest. Every plank he lifted, every nail he drove, became a ritual of forgetting and remembering all at once. Nights were hardest. In the silence of the boarding house, he read her old letter again and again, the ink now faded. He'd memorized every curve of her handwriting, every pause. He kept trying to write new letters but never sent them. What if she'd chosen another life? What if she no longer waited? Then came Patrick Flannery. They met during a strike. Eamon had stood between a foreman's whip and a fellow Irishman, earning a broken rib for his trouble. Patrick, quick with fists and quicker with ideas, helped him up. They shared bread, then stories, then a bond forged in the sweat of men cast aside. Patrick was a firebrand. He believed in workers' rights, Irish independence, and the power of words as much as weapons. Eamon didn't share all his fire, but he respected the flame. Together they attended meetings, raised funds for famine relief back home, and joined rallies where Gaelic was spoken like a song against tyranny. Still, Eamon's heart beat to a quieter rhythm. Every Sunday he walked alone to the harbour, staring at the ships. He imagined Moira stepping off one, her hair hidden under a travelling hat, her eyes scanning faces for his. He clung to that vision like others clung to rosary beads. Years passed. He built a reputation in the shipyards, strong, fair, tireless. He rented a small flat above a tailor's shop, began learning carpentry on the side. But he never courted, never stayed too long at gatherings. When asked, he'd only say, "I once gave my heart to someone, and I didn't ask for it back." Back in Boston, the Irish community grew. Churches rose, accents thickened, and slowly, men like Eamon began to matter. He helped build St. Brendan's, a wooden church for the working poor. He carved the altar by hand, each groove a whisper of prayer. Patrick urged him to move on. "Come west with me," he said once. "Chicago's bursting. You could start fresh." Eamon shook his head. "I already started, just waiting to finish." There were times he doubted. On stormy nights, when news from home brought tales of war and hunger, he wondered if Moira still breathed. The thought hollowed him. But giving up meant admitting their love had an end, and he could not bear that. Then, in 1878, he heard a rumour. A merchant from Dublin, passing through Boston, mentioned a young woman once seen in the north, a Kavanagh girl who vanished from public life after her father's death. "A shame," he'd said. "Quite beautiful, but strange. Some say she went to America." Eamon's pulse had thundered. He grilled the man for every detail, every possible lead. Though the trail was thin, it reignited a fire. Perhaps she had come. Perhaps she searched for him even now. He packed up what little he had and set his sights westward. Not for adventure, not for gold, but because deep in his bones something stirred. A belief not in maps or news, but in the quiet pull of a vow never broken. And somewhere, on a train headed west, Eamon whispered again into the glass, "I will find you, Moira, even if it takes my whole life." Moira Kavanagh escaped under grey skies and silent blessings. By 1879, her father had been dead 2 years, the cousin's estate sold and the last of her fortune dwindling. Her world had grown smaller, lonelier. The only constant was the ache that lived in her chest, shaped like a face she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. No one had ever confessed to burning the letters, but Moira knew. She had written dozens, maybe more, and received nothing in return. Still, she never stopped believing. Something inside her refused to surrender. Eamon hadn't vanished. He had been stolen from her by distance, by pride, by cruelty. So she planned. She worked as a seamstress in a small shop near Dublin, her hands once trained for embroidery, now calloused from mending sailors' trousers and merchant uniforms. She saved every coin, ate little, spoke even less, a lodger in her own country. But every stitch, every button brought her closer to the ocean. In the spring of 1880, she booked passage on a ship bound for New York. Her name on the manifest was Mary Kavanagh, a slight alteration meant to confuse those who might trace her. She carried a single suitcase, a pocket Bible, and a bundle of letters too worn to read, but they weren't for reading. They were reminders of a life that once breathed between 2 people who refused to forget. The voyage was harsh. Storms battered the hull. A child died of fever on the 2nd week, but Moira stood firm on the deck each morning, eyes fixed on the west. She wasn't afraid. She had already lost more than the sea could take. When she stepped off the ship in Manhattan, the world overwhelmed her. Steam hissed from engines, horses clattered over cobblestones, and voices sang in every language but her own. She had never seen buildings so tall, nor people move so fast. But she didn't falter. She had one address, an Irish mission house in Brooklyn run by nuns who aided young women. They gave her shelter, offered her work, and asked no questions. There she began her search. She combed through newspapers, asked around at churches, and inquired at labor halls. "Do you know Eamon Delaney?" Most shook their heads. One man thought he'd heard the name in Boston. Another mentioned Chicago. The trail was cold, but she refused to stop. Moira moved from job to job, housemaid, laundress, finally settling in a dressmaker's shop. She sent letters to Boston parishes, shipyards, even newspapers. Weeks turned into months. Her feet ached each night, her hands blistered again, but her will never cracked. Then, one Sunday in 1881, while visiting a friend in Chicago, she passed a public notice board. Among job postings and lost pet flyers was a handwritten note in Gaelic. "To the girl who once read Byron by moonlight, if you are still searching, I am here." It stopped her heart. She returned twice more before seeing it again. This time, beneath the note, someone had scrawled, "He lives near the docks, ask for Delaney the carpenter." Moira ran the last block. When she reached the workshop, her hands trembled. She opened the door to the scent of wood and dust and something older, something remembered. A man stood at the bench, back turned, humming a hymn from home. She said one word, "Eamon." He dropped the tool, turned slowly. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world unraveled and rewound all at once. No apologies, no explanations. Just the silence of something lost and found again. In that small room of sawdust and sunlight, they stood without moving, as if time itself were holding its breath. The reunion was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Neither screamed, neither wept. Instead, Eamon and Moira stood staring, both unsure if the other was real or imagined. He took a step. She did not move. Then he whispered, "It's really you," and she nodded, her mouth trembling. He reached out slowly, touched her hand as if it might vanish. But it didn't. Her fingers were real, warm. alive. And that was enough. They sat together in the workshop for hours, saying little, the silence filled with everything they had carried. When they finally spoke, it was not to catch up on years lost, but to confirm what had remained unchanged. "I never stopped looking," she said. "Nor did I," he replied. Later that week, they walked along the lakefront, the wind tangling her hair, his hand steady in hers. She told him of her escape, of the voyage, the nights she sewed by candlelight to survive. He told her of Boston, of shipyards and strikes, of a firebrand named Patrick who taught him how to keep hope even in hopelessness. They had missed each other by weeks in New York. Fate had not been cruel. It had been patient. Eamon introduced her to his small circle of friends, most of them Irish exiles with stories nearly as tangled. They welcomed her warmly. Patrick, skeptical at first, watched them together and simply nodded. "A rare thing," he murmured, "seeing something hold this long." Neither Eamon nor Moira cared for the bustle of cities. They spoke often of leaving, of building something away from the noise. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in Eamon's small apartment, she said softly, "I want land. Quiet. A place where the world cannot interrupt us again." He looked into her eyes and answered, "Then we'll find it." Within months, they married in a modest ceremony. No gowns, no crowds, only a priest, Patrick as witness, and a vow that needed no decoration. Moira wore a blue ribbon in her hair, the same color she'd worn the day Eamon first saw her in Clare. After the ceremony, they shared a meal in the back room of a local pub. Eamon toasted, voice steady, "To the woman who crossed an ocean to find what was already hers." Moira smiled and raised her glass. "To the man who waited without knowing how long." They left Chicago with little more than a cart, tools, a few books, and each other. They found a small farmstead in Pennsylvania. Stone house, wide fields, a nearby forest. It was run down, overgrown, but Moira saw possibility. Eamon saw peace. Together, they made it theirs. Life slowed. They woke with the sun, tended the garden, repaired what was broken, and laughed more than they expected. At night, they read aloud. Shakespeare, Yeats, and sometimes the old letters Moira had carried across the sea. They never tired of the words. They rarely spoke of the years they'd lost, not out of denial, but reverence. To dwell on the pain would be to give it more power than it deserved. Instead, they honored the present. One summer, they built a bench beneath a maple tree and carved their initials into it. Below the initials, Eamon etched a phrase, "Never apart again." They began writing their story, not as a memoir, but as a series of letters, as if still courting across time. Moira called it "a love spoken into the walls." They hid the letters between floorboards, in crevices of stone, inside the legs of furniture. Not for others, just in case. "If the house ever forgets us," she once joked, "it will remember through these." Years passed. The world turned. But inside their little farm, the world stood still, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of two people who had finally, resolutely, found home. Their days unfolded gently, like pages of a book read slowly by choice. Eamon and Moira found rhythm in the soil, in the creak of wooden floors, in the hush of wind weaving through fields. The farm did not yield much at first, just potatoes, some hens, and a goat too old to milk, but it was theirs. Every splintered beam, every muddy boot print spoke of life shared. They repaired the roof themselves, laid new stones along the path to the barn, planted lilacs near the fence. Moira tended herbs and wrote in a journal she never let Eamon read. He carved furniture by hand, not to sell, but to give their home shape, each piece born from thought and memory. In the evenings, they read by oil lamp, voices soft, leaning into each other like trees grown too close to separate. Moira loved poetry. Eamon preferred stories of rebellion, of heroes who rose from dust. But both agreed on one thing: nothing was more sacred than silence shared with someone who understood it. They had no children. Whether by nature or fate, the question faded over time. Their love was not defined by lineage, but by presence. Friends who visited often remarked, "It's like stepping into another world with you two." Eamon would smile and say, We just made one that fits. Outside their walls, history marched on. Wars came, men died, cities grew louder. But the Delaneys remained steady. They read the news but did not invite it in. The farmhouse became a place apart, anchored not in time, but in promise. Still, they weren't cut off. They sent bread to the widow next door, tended the neighbor's sheep when sickness struck, and offered shelter once to a child who'd run from a violent home. But always it was the two of them at the center. Moira began writing more letters, not to anyone but to the house itself. Little reflections, moments caught in ink. Today, Eamon sang in the garden. I pretended not to hear so he wouldn't stop. Or he brought me a stone that looked like a heart. I kissed it, then him. She folded each note and tucked it into cracks in the wall, behind beams, under rugs. Eamon joined her eventually. His handwriting was rougher, less poetic, but full of warmth. Moira made soup that could cure any war, I told her so. She pretended to be modest. Or, the snow came early. We sat by the fire, no words, just warmth. They never called it a tradition. They never discussed where the letters went. They simply wrote them, stored them, and trusted the house to remember. As the years passed, they grew slower but no less present. Eamon's hands stiffened, so Moira helped with the tools. Her eyesight dimmed, so he read aloud. They laughed more, often at nothing, often because laughter, like air, was needed. Once, Moira woke in the middle of the night and found Eamon sitting by the window staring out. She asked if he was troubled. "No," he said. "Just thinking how rare it is to keep a promise for this long." She walked to him, wrapped her shawl around them both, and whispered, "It was never a promise. It was just truth." The maple tree they'd carved grew large. Its branches reached wide, casting long shadows over the bench. The initials faded with time, but the groove of the words, "never apart again," remained. Visitors to the farm called it peaceful. Some said enchanted. A traveling preacher once asked why they lived so quietly. Eamon simply answered, "Because we were too loud for the world before." And Moira added, "Now the world is quiet enough for us." In every beam, every letter, every breath between their laughter, the truth remained. They had built not just a home, but a world where love did not need to speak loudly to be heard. The first sign was subtle, a tremor in Moira's hand as she poured tea, a hesitation before finding a familiar word. At first, they laughed it off. "Old bones playing tricks," she'd say. But Eamon noticed the patterns, words misplaced, steps slower, blank moments where her eyes searched the room as if unsure of where she stood. By the autumn of 1951, it was clear. The doctor came once, a quiet man with kind eyes. He didn't speak in absolutes, but his pauses said enough. "She's fading," he told Eamon outside, voice hushed as if to keep the truth from Moira's ears. "You'll need to prepare." Eamon nodded, though no preparation could steady him for the slow erosion of the woman he loved. At first she had good days, baking bread, tending her plants, teasing him gently as always. But on the bad days she'd forget where the bedroom was, or call him by her brother's name, or sit staring at the carved bench, silent as stone. Eamon never raised his voice, never flinched. He simply guided her back gently, patiently, like a lighthouse drawing in a drifting ship. He read their letters aloud, hoping the words would anchor her. Sometimes they did. Sometimes she'd smile and say, "That's a nice line. Did I write it?" One winter evening, as snow tapped the windows and the fire hummed low, she asked, "Eamon, if I forget everything, will you still remember me?" He reached for her hand. "I'll remember for both of us." In the months that followed, he began preparing the house, not just for her passing, but for the memory of them. He dusted every corner, sealed every draft. He reread the letters, hid a few more behind beams, added a final note to their carved bench. And then he started digging. Behind the fireplace, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, was a shallow space he had once planned for storing wine. Now it would hold something else, something sacred. He worked only at night, while she slept, quietly, slowly, with reverence. He laid soft wool blankets along the bottom, then their wedding quilt on top. He placed 2 candles nearby and a rosary between them. When she asked why his hands were so sore, he said, "Old tools, old wood, nothing serious." She believed him, or pretended to. By the winter of 1952, she could no longer walk without help. He carried her most days, out to the porch, back to the bed, to the window to see the snow fall. She hummed often old melodies from Claire, sometimes blending 3 songs into one. He hummed with her. One morning she didn't wake right away. Her breathing was thin. He sat by her side, held her hand and began reading, not from scripture, but from her letters. Ones she had written 30 years earlier, folded and faded. As he read, her eyes opened. "Still here," she whispered. "I never left," he replied. That night, as the cold pressed in and the wind howled over the hills, they sat beside the fire in silence. Moira turned to him and said, "It's time, isn't it?" He nodded once. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a ribbon, the same blue she'd worn in her hair the day they married. She placed it in his hand. "When I go, hold me. Don't let go." "I won't," he said. They walked slowly to the back room. He helped her lie down, wrapped the quilt around them both, and extinguished the lamp. Outside, the snow began to fall. Inside, time paused. And in that small space beneath the floor, wrapped in love and silence, 2 hearts prepared for their last sleep, together. The snowstorm arrived like a hush falling over the world. It began with flurries in the morning, swirling gently through the grey sky. By midday, the wind grew teeth, and by nightfall, the farmhouse stood swallowed in white silence. The nearest road vanished under drifts. Telephone lines sagged and snapped. The world closed in, and Eamon and Moira were alone. Inside, the fire crackled low. Eamon had gathered wood 2 days earlier, as if he'd sensed what was coming. He'd cooked stew that morning, her favourite, and fed her gently, spoon by spoon. She'd eaten little, but smiled after each bite. He kept their wedding quilt near, folded across her legs. Her breathing was shallow now, lips dry, voice no louder than the rustle of paper. "Still," she whispered to him. "Do you remember that first letter I hid in the chapel wall?" He nodded. "You called me a fool for leaving. I didn't mean it. I know." He sat beside her bed, holding her hand beneath the quilt. Outside, the wind howled and pressed against the shutters, but inside all was still. They had no need for more words. They had said all there was to say in the hundreds of letters scattered through their walls, in the glances exchanged over decades, in the life built from silence and vow. She drifted in and out of sleep. He watched the firelight flicker across her face, memorizing every line. When she stirred, he whispered old poems into her ear. He read the Psalms, then a poem from Yeats. Her eyelids fluttered at familiar stanzas. At some point past midnight, she opened her eyes fully, focused on him, and said, "Promise me." He didn't ask what. He simply answered, "I do." He carried her to the back room, their final resting place already prepared. The floorboard lifted easily now. He'd lined the hidden space with cedar and wool, placed 2 candles on each side. The wedding quilt rested inside, folded neatly, beside the blue ribbon and a rosary. He lowered her gently, lying beside her, their hands entwined as they always had been. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Together?" "Always." He lit the candles. The soft glow filled the small chamber, shadows dancing over the stone. She exhaled a final time, quiet, like a sigh releasing decades. Eamon didn't weep. He lay there in the stillness, watching the flame, remembering everything. The chapel, the shipyards, the letters, the blue ribbon, her laugh when he burned a pie, the look in her eyes the morning she stepped into his workshop. He stayed there until dawn began to lighten the storm. Then he reached for her hand again, laced his fingers in hers, and closed his eyes. He did not leave her, and when the wind howled louder, when the last ember in the fireplace gave up its glow, when the house grew cold and the world moved on, they remained, curled together beneath the floorboards, beneath the stone and quilt, in a space they had built for love and memory. The storm raged for 2 more days, burying the paths, bending the trees, sealing the world shut. No one came. No one knocked, and that was exactly how they had planned it. For a love that had endured war, ocean, silence, and time, it was the quietest and most sacred goodbye. They had sworn never to part, and they never did. Years passed. The house stood quiet on its hill, weathered but proud. Seasons cycled endlessly. Snow gave way to bloom, bloom to sun, sun to rust. Vines crept over the stone walls. Shutters clattered loose in the wind. The world changed around it, but the house remained still, like a monument no one remembered. Ownership blurred. Neighbors died or moved. No heirs stepped forward. Some said the place was cursed. Others simply forgot it existed. The road nearby was rerouted. Fewer and fewer people passed. Eventually it became nothing more than a shadow in the woods, a name without a door. Children whispered about it. They said ghosts lived there, that lights flickered at night. But no one dared approach. No one entered. Until in 1981, a boy named Liam dared to prove a dare wrong. He was 12, skinny, fast-talking, wild-eyed. Armed with a flashlight, he crept through the woods with two friends behind him. They pushed open the swollen front door and stepped into the dust of decades. Cobwebs hung like lace from the ceiling. The air smelled of old stone and something deeper, something like memory. Liam wandered room to room, narrating like an explorer. This was probably the parlor. Look, still got chairs. But when he stepped into the back room, the floor groaned under his weight. One step too far and it cracked. He fell through. The cavity wasn't deep, just enough to knock the wind out of him. His friends screamed. He groaned, waved a hand. "I'm fine, just stuck." When they pulled him up, one of them noticed something strange in the hole. Bone, then another. Then the edge of a blanket. The police arrived that evening. By morning, the house was roped off and a forensic team was sifting through the space beneath the floor. What they found stunned even the most seasoned officers. Two skeletons, side by side, perfectly positioned, wrapped in cloth, their hands entwined. There were no signs of violence, no restraints, no drugs, only peace. The coroner's report confirmed what many feared to believe. The remains had been there for at least 3 decades, possibly longer. The mystery consumed the town. Who were they? Why had no one looked for them? Then, during the inspection of the walls, an officer discovered a loose panel in the main room. Behind it, a bundle of yellowed paper tied with ribbon. Letters, dozens. Each signed, "Yours, Moira." Over the next week they found more. Under floorboards, inside table legs, tucked into bricks behind the fireplace, hundreds of pages, all written in delicate, expressive script. Some from Moira, some from Eamon. Together they wove a love story that spanned continents, decades, and heartbreak. The letters weren't dated in chronological order. Some were from their early days, others from their life on the farm. One was a simple note: "If anyone ever finds this, know we were not afraid. We were ready, and we were never alone." The story broke nationally within days. The media dubbed them the lovers beneath the floor. But to those who read their words, they were something more, witnesses to devotion beyond understanding. Reporters flocked to the site. Scholars requested access to the letters. A local history professor began transcribing them, publishing excerpts in the regional paper. Readers wept over sentences like, "Even if the world forgets us, these walls will remember." Forensics eventually identified them as Eamon and Moira Delaney. The record showed an old deed, long abandoned, a quiet marriage in Chicago. No children, no heirs, only a trail of documents and the home they left behind. The town fell silent again. But this time the silence wasn't empty. It was reverent. News of the discovery spread beyond County Clare within days. Radio stations aired brief summaries. Newspapers printed grainy photos of the house, the carved bench, the letters found behind the walls. The world, hungry for something pure amid its noise, paused to listen. And then came the letters, fragments of a love story slowly unwrapped by careful hands. The first one published began simply, "To my Eamon, who waits across oceans and lifetimes, know this: I am coming." Not with riches or triumphs, but with the quiet certainty that what we have defies absence. Readers clutched their newspapers tighter. Libraries requested full collections. Teachers read excerpts aloud in classrooms. Journalists from Dublin, London, and New York booked flights to Shannon, trying to trace the route the lovers once walked. The town of Kilnabrack, long quiet, woke up. Locals who'd ignored the house for years now gathered daily at the gate. An older woman remembered Moira as a girl. A farmer's grandson said he'd once heard stories about a man who vanished to America, leaving behind a girl with sea-colored eyes. Volunteers organized to clean the property. The house, still sturdy beneath time's weathering hand, was gently restored. Letters were catalogued, scanned, and displayed in a makeshift museum set up in the local parish hall. The exhibit opened with a simple quote, engraved on glass. "Even if no one hears our story, we will still have lived it." People cried while reading. Strangers clutched hands. Couples stood in silence, letting the words seep in. One visitor left a note on the altar. "You remind me why I stayed." It wasn't just their love that moved people. It was the way they had documented it, hidden it, protected it, as one might protect fire in the cold. The letters weren't dramatic. They were honest, full of small moments, inside jokes, tender observations. "You looked at the sky this morning as if it belonged to you." And I thought, maybe it does. "Today I found a stone shaped like your laugh." We said nothing tonight, it was everything I needed. Local high school students, assigned to write reflections, called them better than Shakespeare. An American filmmaker flew in to propose a documentary. Our poet dedicated her newest volume to the ones beneath the floor. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came weeks later. While cleaning the attic, a restorer found a small box sealed in wax. Inside was a final letter, untouched by time. The handwriting was shakier than the rest. The date read January 1953. It read, "If this house ever breathes again and someone finds us, please know we chose this. There was no tragedy. There was only devotion. This world was too loud. We made our own silence, and it was full." The final line, "They swore never to part," and they didn't. After that, the debate ended. No one speculated further. There was no crime, no abandonment, only a vow fulfilled. Eamon and Moira were reburied beneath the maple tree they once carved. The town erected a simple stone there, with no dates, just their names, and beneath, "Never apart again." Visitors still come. Some leave flowers, others letters. A few simply sit on the bench, hands folded, eyes closed, listening. Because in that place it feels possible to hear them, still whispering, still laughing softly, somewhere just beneath the floorboards. And in their story, people found more than romance. They found a promise kept, a reminder that love, at its purest, is not fireworks or declarations. It is endurance. It is presence. It is two hands intertwined, choosing again and again, even in silence, even in storm, even beneath stone, to never let go. When the letters were finally organized and displayed, they were arranged not by date, but by emotion, hope, longing, fear, joy, peace. The curators believed the heart understood order better than the mind. Visitors wandered between glass cases in silence, tracing the curve of ink as if touching the past. A letter from Eamon. "There are nights when I swear I hear your voice in the wind, like it's looking for me." A reply from Moira. "You're not imagining it. I send pieces of myself to you whenever I can." Their story no longer belonged just to the past. It had become something more, a mirror held up to the present. Strangers found comfort in the way Moira wrote about ordinary things, how the light hit the window, how Eamon's hands always smelled faintly of pine, how silence could feel safer than speech. A journalist who'd flown in from Paris wrote, "I came looking for a headline and left holding my wife's hand tighter than I ever had before." Young couples began reading the letters aloud on park benches. People who had grown cynical about love found themselves undone by a line as simple as, "Even in stillness, I feel your breath against the world." The letters were translated into over 20 languages. Excerpts were read at weddings. A composer set 6 of them to music, slow, haunting piano melodies that echoed across cathedrals. They were not grand pronouncements, these letters. They were soft declarations, private and vulnerable, stitched together by devotion. In one, Moira wrote, "Some loves are loud and burn quickly. Ours was the ember. It lasted through every storm." Even those unfamiliar with Irish history began learning about the famine, the mass emigrations, the way people were scattered across oceans, holding on to scraps of identity through letters and faith. Eamon and Moira became more than individuals. They became a symbol of connection in disconnection, of presence in absence. A schoolteacher in Galway began using their letters to teach empathy. "Read this," she told her class, pointing to Eamon's handwriting. "Tell me how it feels to love someone you may never see again." And the children, eyes wide, read aloud the words that still echoed more than a century later. "If the sea takes me, let it carry your name on every wave." Tourism to the house grew, but it was not a loud crowd. There were no selfies, no loud voices, just quiet steps. People moved through the room slowly, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling. The bench under the maple became a place of pilgrimage. A couple from Italy got engaged there. A widow from Belfast scattered her husband's ashes nearby. Each visitor left something: a flower, a letter, a ribbon, a folded piece of cloth, and over time a tradition grew. People began writing their own promises and hiding them in the house beneath a loose brick inside a drawer behind the clock. They weren't trying to mimic Eamon and Moira. They were trying to honor them, to keep the silence full. One woman, after reading every letter in the exhibit, wrote in the guestbook, "I thought I was too late to believe in something like this." But maybe love isn't something you find. Maybe it's something you choose again and again. In a world often defined by urgency, the Delaneys reminded everyone that love could be slow, that it could be quiet, that it could be enough. Because they hadn't lived loudly, they hadn't chased fame or left behind a dynasty, they had simply kept a promise. And in doing so, they gave the world something more lasting than any monument. They gave it memory, they gave it meaning, they gave it proof that even in forgotten houses, behind broken walls, love waits. The legacy of Eamon and Moira Delaney extended far beyond the walls that had once cradled their final breath. What began as a rediscovered tragedy unfolded into a quiet revolution of memory. They had lived in obscurity, but in death, their love ignited something vast, intimate, and enduring. Within a year of the letter's discovery, artists began to arrive. A painter from Vienna captured the shadowed outline of the farmhouse against the rising sun. In the foreground, two figures, barely more than silhouettes, stood holding hands beneath the maple tree. The painting, titled Stillness, was sold and later donated to a museum in Dublin, where it hung beside a display of the original letters. A sculptor from Japan created twin figures carved from oak, leaning toward each other but never touching, connected only by a ribbon of iron shaped like a shared breath. It stood outside the parish hall in Kilnabrack, a permanent reminder of presence even in absence. Poets wove their words around the Delaneys like ivy on stone. One wrote, "They did not die. They became part of every silence that ever meant something." Universities held lectures on their story, dissecting the way their letters blurred fact and feeling, personal memory and universal truth. Scholars noted how their words lacked bitterness, how even the most sorrowful lines contained gentleness. It was, they agreed, the texture of devotion, not the loud kind, but the kind that survives time itself. Filmmakers came too, documentaries, dramas, stage adaptations, but none could capture what the house itself still held. Most visitors said the same thing upon leaving: "It feels like they're still there." Perhaps they were. In the nearby village, a couple who had visited the exhibit twice named their newborn twins Eamon and Moira. They weren't the only ones. Over the next decade, dozens of children bore the names. A name, after all, is a form of resurrection. The house became a heritage site, not roped off or sterilized, but preserved with care. Visitors could walk the rooms, sit on the bench, even read letter replicas placed along the mantel. The original pages were stored under glass, but their copies breathed freely, carried in the hands of strangers across the globe. Every year on the anniversary of their discovery, a vigil was held. No speeches. No formal program, just people lighting candles, reading aloud their favorite letters, leaving offerings in the quiet, poems, drawings, folded scraps of paper. One year, during such a vigil, a child asked her mother, "Why did they hide all their letters?" The mother knelt down, smiled, and answered, "They weren't hiding, they were planting them, so that someone like you could find them and know what love really looks like." That was how the world came to see the Delaneys, not as tragic lovers, but as planters of memory. Their devotion had not ended in secrecy, but in quiet defiance of time. They had built a life, a love, and then sealed it into the walls like a song left in a bottle. People left with more than stories. They left with questions whispered to themselves. Have I ever loved like that? Would I wait? Would I remember? And often, more importantly, could I choose again, more carefully, more kindly, more fully? Their legacy was not grand. It was not loud. It was not gold or empire or revolution. It was two people choosing each other, again and again, in the face of silence, in the face of distance, in the face of forgetting. And somehow, because they did, the world remembered. In every great love story, there is a moment that lingers long after the final word. For Eamon and Moira, that moment was not a dramatic farewell or a triumphant reunion. It was the vow they made beneath the stars, long before oceans and years came between them. We will never part. It was not a metaphor. It was not romantic embellishment. It was a blueprint, a quiet decision to build a life that defied disconnection. And they had kept it, not through grand gestures, but through daily acts of remembering. When scholars studied their letters, they often remarked on what was missing. There was no bitterness, no regret. Even in the hardest moments, even when separated by thousands of miles, the tone was always one of trust. In one of Eamon's earliest letters from Boston, he wrote, "I don't know where you are, but I speak to you every night before I sleep. I imagine your breath against the dark and I find rest." And Moira, years later, wrote, "You are my certainty in an uncertain world. I could be anywhere, in any year, and still I would find you." This was what people clung to, not the tragedy of their end, but the clarity of their love. The vow they had made was tested again and again, by silence, by exile, by time. Yet they never broke it, and in their final act, choosing to die together, gently, quietly, side by side, they made it permanent. It left many to ask, what does it mean to vow something with your life and then honor it with your death? Not everyone agreed. Some critics saw their final choice as selfish, even indulgent. What if they'd reached out? One journalist questioned. They might have been saved. But those who read the letters deeply saw something else. They weren't running from life. They had simply completed it. They had lived the version they'd chosen, loved fully within it, and when the time came, stepped into rest as one. Their story forced people to reconsider the meaning of permanence. In a world that moves fast, that breaks promises as easily as bread, Eamon and Moira offered another way to remain, to choose, to remember. It wasn't about avoiding suffering. Their lives had been full of it. It was about what they did with the pain. They turned it into poetry, into memory, into quiet resilience. A university thesis later summarized it perfectly. The Delaneys did not teach us how to fall in love. They taught us how to stay. And perhaps that was why their story endured. Because beneath the history, the letters, the artifacts, lay something elemental. A reminder that love, real love, is not always loud. It is not always beautiful. It is often quiet, often hard. But when chosen with intention, it becomes unbreakable. In the museum, under soft lights, a single letter is framed in its own glass case. It was one of the last ones written, likely weeks before their final winter. It reads, "When I am no longer here, I ask only one thing, that you do not walk away from the world we made. Stay here, even if I forget your name, even if my hands forget your touch. Stay." That is the vow. Not that we live forever, but that we choose each other until the end. The page is signed simply, "Forever yours, Moira," and beside it, in a different case, Eamon's reply, "Then I will stay, in silence, in shadow, in the spaces you still breathe. Until the last light fades, I will be beside you, I promise. the vow remembered, the vow fulfilled, and in that remembering they lived on. If you listened closely, you could still hear it, the pulse of something gentle, resilient, unbreakable, winding through the ruins and rebirth of that small farmhouse in County Clare. The world would forget most names, most stories, but the names of Eamon and Moira Delaney lingered, woven into the hush between seasons and the laughter of children playing by the old stone wall. The tale that began as a whispered secret, hidden beneath floorboards and sealed in silence, had become a kind of shared heartbeat. For every person who read one of Moira's letters, who pressed a hand to the rough stone bench beneath the maple tree, who lingered just a little longer in the museum at dusk, their story offered a simple invitation: to choose love when it is difficult. To choose memory when forgetting is easier. To choose presence day after day even when time is cruel. Across the world, thousands carried that invitation home with them. Some wrote letters they'd been meaning to write for years. Others held their partner's hands a little tighter. A few forgave old hurts, letting silence fill with something kinder. For some, the Delaneys were an echo of lost possibilities. For others, they were a map to something still possible, still worth pursuing. They did not promise that love conquers all, only that love, when chosen deliberately, can outlast even its own ending. In the end, their story wasn't just about romance, it was about endurance. About building something sacred out of the ordinary: a letter, a loaf of bread, a blue ribbon, a carved phrase on a wooden bench. Teachers brought students to the site, urging them to read not just for the drama, but for the details. The way Eamon spoke of rain on windows, the way Moira wrote about hope tucked into the corners of every day. At every anniversary vigil, someone would read aloud the line that had become a kind of prayer: "They swore never to part, and they never did." It was a promise kept not just in life, but in memory, not just by them, but by all who heard and remembered. And as we close the pages of this story, perhaps the greatest lesson is not about how to find a love like theirs, but how to notice it, choose it, tend to it when it appears. In the clutter and noise of modern life, perhaps what lasts is not always the loudest declaration, but the smallest, most consistent vow. If this story touched you, if you found a piece of yourself in the silences between the Delaneys' words, consider subscribing. Your support allows us to bring more hidden histories, more testaments to the endurance of the human heart, into the light. There are countless stories waiting to be discovered, some beneath floorboards, some buried in letters, some in the spaces we too often overlook. And before you go, don't miss the next chapter in our series. Click the video suggested on your screen now to discover another extraordinary love story, one that defied time, distance, and every expectation. Sometimes the truest stories are the ones we almost never hear. Thank you for sharing this journey, for believing, if only for a moment, in the vow that kept Eamon and Moira Delaney together, against every odd for all time.